What was it like? The very first time two species of humans locked eyes across the firelight. When Homo sapiens, wandering from Africa, met Neanderthals in the frozen forests of Europe, was it fear, was it wonder, or was it the beginning of a struggle that would decide who ruled the earth? Picture, if you will, the dying light of a Pleistocene evening, the sun setting over landscapes that exist now only in our collective genetic memory, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood, while shadows lengthen across valleys where mammoth herds thunder past in clouds of dust and the scent of approaching winter hangs heavy in the air. In this world of ice and fire, of endless migrations and desperate survival, two branches of the human family tree are about to converge in an encounter that will echo through millennia, shaping not just the future of our species, but the very essence of what it means to be human. This is the story of that first meeting, that pivotal moment when Homo sapiens, the restless wanderers from Africa, came face to face with the Neanderthals, the hardy survivors who had already claimed Europe as their home for hundreds of thousands of years, and in that meeting, both species would be forever changed, their destinies intertwined in ways that we are only now beginning to understand, their legacy written not just in stone tools and cave paintings, but in the very DNA that flows through our veins today. Before we begin this journey through deep time, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and at what time of day you're joining us on this exploration of our shared human story. In the beginning, there was fire, and with fire came the first whispers of what we might recognize as humanity itself, not merely the biological fact of human existence, but something deeper, something that transformed scattered bands of clever apes into the architects of their own destiny. Imagine standing in the heart of Africa nearly 2 million years ago, where the savannas stretch endlessly under a sky unmarked by the contrails of aircraft or the glow of distant cities, where the only light after sunset comes from the stars and the tentative, precious flicker of flame carefully nurtured by hands that are learning, for the first time in the history of life on Earth, to hold and shape the very essence of transformation itself. Fire was more than warmth, more than protection from the prowling shadows that circled just beyond the light. It was the first technology that truly separated human consciousness from the rest of the natural world, creating a sphere of controlled environment where minds could gather in the dancing illumination and begin the long, slow process of becoming something unprecedented in the 4 billion-year history of life on this planet. Around those first fires, our ancestors learned to cook meat, breaking down tough fibers and unlocking nutrients that would fuel the explosive growth of brains capable of abstract thought, of planning, of imagining futures that did not yet exist, and then working together to bring those imagined futures into being. But fire brought more than physical nourishment. It created the first truly human spaces, circles of light where stories could be told, where knowledge could be shared, where the experiences of one individual could become part of the collective wisdom of the group. In the hypnotic dance of flames against the African night, language evolved from simple calls and gestures into something rich and complex enough to carry not just immediate information about where the herds were grazing or which waterholes still held sweet water, but abstract concepts, memories of the distant past, hopes for the future, and perhaps most importantly, the growing understanding that they were not alone in the world, that other groups of humans existed beyond the horizon, groups with their own fires, their own stories, their own slowly evolving understanding of what it meant to be human. As the millennia passed and the climate shifted, driving some groups northward out of Africa in waves of migration that would eventually populate the entire planet, these firekeepers carried with them not just the practical knowledge of tool-making and hunting, but something infinitely more precious, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had sat around countless fires, sharing their understanding of how to survive, how to think, how to imagine, and how to dream. They carried within their minds and their cultures the seeds of art, of music, of spiritual understanding, of the complex social structures that would eventually give rise to everything from cave paintings to cathedrals, from simple bone flutes to symphonies, from the first tentative scratches on cave walls that might represent the movements of animals to the written languages that would preserve human knowledge across centuries. Yet even as these early humans spread across the landscape, mastering fire and stone, developing the first crude shelters and the first systematic hunting strategies, they were not alone on the planet. Far to the north, in the valleys and forests of Europe and Western Asia, another branch of the human family tree was pursuing its own path toward consciousness, its own relationship with fire and tool, and the endless challenge of survival in a world that seemed determined to test every innovation, every adaptation, every attempt to carve out a sustainable existence from the raw materials of stone and bone and sinew and will. The Neanderthals had discovered fire independently, or perhaps inherited it from earlier human ancestors, but they had made it their own in ways that reflected their unique environment and their particular genius for survival in the harsh conditions of Ice Age Europe. Their fires burned in cave mouths and rock shelters, providing warmth through winters that could kill the unprepared, creating spaces where they too gathered to share food and knowledge, to craft the sophisticated tools that archaeologists would later marvel at for their precision and effectiveness, and perhaps, in ways we are only beginning to understand, to develop their own rich cultural traditions that included the careful burial of their dead, the creation of ornaments and symbolic objects, and even the beginnings of what we might recognize as art. For hundreds of thousands of years, these two lineages of humanity developed in parallel, each adapting to their own environmental challenges, each developing their own solutions to the fundamental problems of survival, each creating their own unique relationship with fire and stone, and the natural world around them. The Neanderthals became masters of the European landscape, learning to hunt massive cave bears and woolly mammoths, developing sophisticated strategies for surviving the advance and retreat of glaciers, creating tools so perfectly adapted to their environment that modern experiments have shown them to be remarkably effective even by contemporary standards. Meanwhile, in Africa and gradually spreading into Asia, Homo sapiens was developing its own distinctive culture, characterized by greater mobility, more varied tool traditions, and perhaps most significantly, an increasing capacity for symbolic thought and artistic expression. Neither group knew of the other's existence, separated as they were by thousands of miles and hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution. Yet both were following parallel paths toward greater complexity, greater consciousness, greater mastery over their environment. The fires that burned in Neanderthal caves cast the same dancing shadows, created the same intimate circles of warmth and light, where knowledge could be shared and culture could evolve. The tools that emerged from Neanderthal workshops showed the same careful attention to function and form, the same understanding of stone and bone and wood as raw materials that could be shaped by intelligence and skill into extensions of human will and intention. And so the stage was set for one of the most significant encounters in human history, though neither species could have imagined what was coming. As the climate shifted once again, and the migrations of animals and the search for new territories drew both groups toward the same regions of the Middle East and Europe, the two branches of the human family tree were about to converge in ways that would forever change both lineages and create legacies that persist in our genes, our cultures, and our understanding of what it means to be human even today, tens of thousands of years later, as we sit around our own metaphorical fires, the glowing screens and warm spaces where we gather to share stories and seek understanding of our place in the vast sweep of cosmic time. Somewhere between 70 and 100,000 years ago, as the African continent pulsed with the rhythms of climate change and the endless dance of wet seasons and droughts, a restlessness began to stir in the camps of Homo sapiens that would ultimately drive our species to the far corners of the earth, a wanderlust written into our very DNA that compels us even today to look beyond the next hill, to wonder what lies on the other side of the ocean, to dream of worlds we have never seen, and then set out to discover them with nothing but our wits and our will and our unshakable faith that somewhere out there new possibilities await. The Great Migration out of Africa was not a single dramatic exodus, not a moment of collective decision when thousands of individuals suddenly picked up their possessions and marched northward toward unknown territories, but rather a slow, gradual process of expansion that took place over millennia, driven by the complex interplay of environmental pressures, population growth, technological innovation, and perhaps most fundamentally, by the uniquely human combination of curiosity and courage that makes it possible to leave behind everything familiar and safe in pursuit of something better, something new, something that exists only as a possibility in the imagination. Picture those first explorers, small bands of perhaps 20 or 30 individuals, carrying with them everything they owned, stone tools carefully crafted and maintained, fire-making equipment that represented the difference between life and death, knowledge of which plants could heal and which could kill, understanding of animal behavior and weather patterns, and the subtle signs that could mean the difference between finding water and dying of thirst in landscapes that stretched beyond the horizon without a single familiar landmark to guide the way back home. They moved slowly, following river valleys and coastlines, pausing for months or years in places where game was plentiful and water was reliable, gradually adapting to new environments that challenged every assumption about how to survive, how to find food, how to read the behavior of unfamiliar animals and the patterns of unfamiliar seasons. Some groups turned back, defeated by drought or disease or the simple overwhelming difficulty of surviving in places where none of their accumulated wisdom seemed to apply. Others pressed forward, driven by necessity or curiosity, or the discovery that these new lands offered opportunities that simply did not exist in the crowded territories they had left behind. As they moved north and east, following the great river systems that provided highways through otherwise impassable terrain, these pioneer populations began to encounter environments unlike anything in their African homeland. Desert landscapes where water existed only in hidden springs and rare oases, mountain ranges that required entirely new strategies for finding shelter and staying warm, coastal regions where the sea offered new sources of food but also new dangers, new rhythms of tide and storm that had to be learned through careful observation and costly mistakes. Each new environment demanded innovation, adaptation, the development of new tools and new techniques, and new forms of knowledge that could only be acquired through direct experience, through trial and error, through the gradual accumulation of understanding that comes from living intimately with a landscape until every subtle change in weather patterns, every shift in animal behavior, every variation in plant growth becomes part of an internal map that makes survival possible in places that would kill the unprepared within days or weeks. Along the way, these migrating populations split and merged, adapted and evolved, developing the first hints of the cultural and genetic diversity that characterizes our species today. Groups that settled in different environments began to develop different physical characteristics, different tool traditions, different strategies for survival that reflected the particular challenges and opportunities of their chosen territories. Some became specialists in hunting large game across open grasslands, developing the coordination and planning skills necessary to bring down mammoths and giant bison. Others adapted to life in dense forests, learning to track smaller, more elusive prey and to navigate by subtle landmarks in environments where visibility was limited and every tree looked much like every other tree. But perhaps most remarkably, despite this growing diversity of environment and culture, these scattered populations maintained their essential humanity, their capacity for innovation and adaptation, their ability to learn from each other and to integrate new discoveries into their existing knowledge base. When different groups encountered each other after generations of separation, they could still recognize each other as kin, still share knowledge and techniques, still interbreed and create new combinations of genes and cultures that were stronger and more adaptable than either parent population alone. By 60,000 years ago, some of these pioneering groups had reached the Middle East, that crucial crossroads between Africa, Asia, and Europe, where three continents meet and where the great migrations of animals and humans have been funneled for millions of years. Here, in valleys and caves that archaeologists would later recognize as some of the most important sites in human prehistory, Homo sapiens began to encounter the first tantalizing evidence that they were not alone in the world, that other kinds of humans had passed this way before them, and might still be somewhere in the vast territories that lay ahead. Stone tools of unfamiliar design, hearths built according to different traditions, even scattered bones that showed subtle but unmistakable differences from their own anatomy, all of this pointed to the existence of other intelligent beings who had mastered fire and stone, who had developed their own solutions to the challenges of survival, who had their own cultures and their own understanding of how to live in harmony with the natural world. The realization must have been both thrilling and terrifying, opening up possibilities for trade and cooperation and shared knowledge, but also raising fundamental questions about identity and territory, and the right to resources that had seemed unlimited when they were the only humans in the landscape. As they pressed further north and west, following game trails and river valleys into the heart of Europe, these migrant populations were entering territories that had been home to other humans for hundreds of thousands of years, lands where every cave and valley and hunting ground was already known and claimed, where other fires had burned and other voices had echoed off the limestone cliffs, where the very stones seemed to whisper of ancient presence and long-established ways of life that would not yield easily to newcomers, no matter how clever or adaptable or determined they might be. The stage was set for encounter, for the meeting of two worlds, two ways of being human, two different solutions to the fundamental challenge of consciousness in a universe that seems indifferent to our existence. What would happen when these two lineages finally came face to face? How would they communicate across the vast gulf of evolutionary separation? Would they recognize each other as kin, as fellow travelers on the long road toward greater consciousness and understanding, or would they see only competitors, threats to be eliminated or avoided in the eternal struggle for survival? The answer would shape not only the future of both species, but the entire trajectory of human development on Earth, creating legacies that we are still discovering today in our genes, our cultures, and our enduring capacity for both cooperation and conflict in the face of the unknown. Long before the first Homo sapiens footprint marked the frost-covered ground of Europe, another human consciousness had already made this harsh and beautiful landscape home, had learned its secrets and mastered its challenges and built a civilization as sophisticated in its own way as anything that would follow, though it left behind no cities or monuments, only the subtle traces that patient archaeologists would piece together hundreds of thousands of years later to reveal a portrait of our cousins, the Neanderthals, who were perhaps more like us than we ever dared imagine, and certainly more remarkable than early science was prepared to acknowledge. Imagine Europe 400,000 years ago, a continent locked in the grip of ice ages that advanced and retreated with geological patience, carving valleys and leaving behind vast moraines of stone and debris, creating a landscape of dramatic contrasts where glacial ice might lie within a day's walk of temperate forests, where the climate could shift from relatively mild to lethally cold within a few generations, demanding adaptations that went far beyond mere physical survival to encompass sophisticated planning, complex social cooperation, and technological innovations that would not have been out of place in much more recent human societies. Into this challenging environment came the ancestors of the Neanderthals, early human populations that had left Africa hundreds of thousands of years before the great Homo sapiens migrations, following their own paths of exploration and discovery, developing their own relationships with fire and stone, and the endless challenge of extracting life from landscapes that seemed designed to test every innovation, every adaptation, every attempt to establish sustainable communities in the face of climate change, predation, and the simple overwhelming difficulty of finding enough food to survive through winters that could last for months without a break in the cold. Over the course of hundreds of millennia, these populations evolved both physically and culturally, becoming the robust, powerfully built humans we call Neanderthals, with their distinctive heavy brows and large brains, their barrel chests and short limbs perfectly adapted for conserving heat in cold climates, their incredibly strong hands capable of gripping spears with enough force to hunt the massive animals that dominated the European landscape, cave bears that stood 12 feet tall when reared up on their hind legs, woolly mammoths whose tusks could grow longer than a man is tall, woolly rhinoceros with horns that could pierce the thick hide of any predator foolish enough to challenge them. But the Neanderthals were far more than just successful hunters, far more than the brutish cavemen of popular imagination. They were sophisticated tool makers whose stone implements showed levels of planning and skill that modern craftsmen struggle to replicate, creators of composite tools that combined stone points with wooden shafts using adhesives made from birch bark tar, a process that requires precise temperature control and timing, and represents one of the earliest examples of what we might call chemistry being used in service of technology. They were artists who created jewelry from eagle talons and shells, who decorated their bodies with pigments, who arranged bear skulls in what appear to be ritual displays that suggest a rich spiritual life, and perhaps the earliest examples of religious or ceremonial behavior in human history. Archaeological evidence suggests that Neanderthal communities were complex social organizations where knowledge was carefully preserved and transmitted from generation to generation, where specialized roles allowed different individuals to focus on different aspects of survival: tool-making, hunting, gathering, child-rearing, the maintenance of fire and shelter, and where cooperation extended beyond immediate family groups to encompass larger networks of alliance and mutual support that could span hundreds of miles and involve dozens of separate bands or communities. They buried their dead with care, sometimes including grave goods that suggest beliefs about an afterlife or at least about the continuing significance of deceased individuals within the community of memory. They cared for the elderly and disabled, with fossil evidence showing individuals who survived for years with injuries that would have been fatal without sustained care from their communities, suggesting forms of altruism and social responsibility that go far beyond mere survival necessity to encompass something we might recognize as compassion, as the understanding that consciousness itself is precious and worthy of preservation, even when it no longer contributes directly to the material welfare of the group. Their mastery of their environment was comprehensive and impressive. They knew which plants could provide nutrition during the lean months of winter, which animals could be hunted safely, and which were too dangerous to approach, how to predict weather patterns and seasonal changes, how to find or create shelter in landscapes where natural protection was scarce, how to maintain fire through months of cold and damp when fuel was difficult to find, and every spark was precious beyond measure. They developed techniques for preserving meat through drying and smoking, for working hides into clothing and shelter materials, for crafting tools from bone and antler and wood as well as stone. Perhaps most remarkably, they developed what appears to be a sophisticated understanding of medicine, using plants and minerals to treat wounds and illness, performing what may have been surgical procedures, and maintaining knowledge of anatomy and physiology that allowed them to survive in conditions that would challenge modern humans even with all our technological advantages. Evidence suggests they may have used willow bark for pain relief, applied clay and plant poultices to wounds, and even performed basic dental work to deal with the wear and damage that came from their demanding lifestyle. Their territory stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Ural Mountains, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle, encompassing an incredible diversity of environments and ecological niches, each of which required its own specialized knowledge and techniques. Neanderthal populations adapted to life in dense forests and open tundra, in Mediterranean coastal regions and harsh continental interiors, developing regional variations in tool-making traditions and hunting strategies that reflected both local conditions and cultural preferences passed down through generations of accumulated experience. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were the undisputed masters of Europe, the apex predators in a landscape filled with creatures that would seem mythological to modern eyes: giant cave lions, massive cave bears, herds of reindeer that darkened the horizon as they migrated across the tundra, aurochs whose bulls stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder, and always the great mammoths whose ivory tusks provided raw material for tools, and whose meat could feed a band for weeks if properly preserved and managed. But mastery is always temporary, and even the most successful adaptations can become vulnerabilities when conditions change rapidly enough. As the climate continued its endless cycle of warming and cooling, as ice ages came and went with increasing frequency and intensity, the Neanderthal populations found themselves under increasing pressure, not just from environmental change, but from the growing awareness that they were no longer alone in their world, that other kinds of humans were moving through their territories, humans with different tools and different strategies, and perhaps most unsettling of all, different ideas about what it meant to be human and how human communities should relate to each other and to the natural world around them. The signs would have been subtle at first: unfamiliar tool fragments found at abandoned campsites, different patterns of bone breakage at kill sites, perhaps even brief glimpses of distant figures moving across the landscape in ways that seemed almost familiar but not quite right, not quite Neanderthal, carrying with them the promise and threat of encounter, of contact between two different experiments in human consciousness, two different answers to the question of how intelligence might find its place in a universe that offers no guarantees, no promise of survival, no assurance that consciousness itself is anything more than a temporary accident in the long evolution of matter toward greater complexity and understanding. Picture the moment, though no human eye witnessed it, and no human memory preserved it, though it exists now only in the realm of informed speculation and the whispered possibilities that emerge when we trace the patterns of stone tools and genetic markers backward through time toward that pivotal instant, when two different kinds of human consciousness first recognized each other across a landscape that neither could claim as exclusively their own, when the long parallel evolution of our species suddenly converged in an encounter that would change both lineages forever, and set in motion forces that continue to shape human civilization even today. It might have happened in the Levant, that crossroads between continents where the great migration routes of animals and humans have intersected for millions of years, or perhaps in the river valleys of Europe where Neanderthal hunting parties following mammoth herds suddenly found themselves facing strangers, whose tools were subtly different, whose faces carried unfamiliar features, whose voices spoke in sounds that almost made sense but not quite, creating a moment of mutual recognition and mutual uncertainty that must have sent ripples of significance through both communities, though neither could have imagined the long-term consequences of this first tentative contact between two branches of the human family tree. Imagine standing in that ancient valley as the morning mist rises from a river whose name has been forgotten for 40,000 years. Watching as a small band of Homo sapiens hunters moves cautiously through terrain that shows clear signs of human habitation, fire-cracked rocks scattered around carefully constructed hearths, tool-making debris that speaks of sophisticated stoneworking techniques, the subtle paths that develop when the same routes are traveled repeatedly by people who know the landscape intimately and have learned to move through it with minimum effort and maximum awareness of both opportunities and dangers. The Neanderthal hunting party would have noticed the strangers long before direct contact became inevitable, reading the signs with skills honed through generations of survival in territories where the ability to distinguish between friend and potential threat could mean the difference between successful cooperation and devastating conflict. These newcomers moved differently, carried themselves with subtle variations in posture and gait that suggested different hunting traditions, different relationships with the landscape, different assumptions about how human communities should organize themselves and relate to the natural world around them. The first moments of actual encounter must have been fraught with uncertainty and potential for both cooperation and conflict. Two groups of intelligent beings, each armed and experienced in violence when necessary for survival, each protective of territories and resources that represented the difference between life and death for their communities, each carrying cultural traditions and accumulated wisdom that had been tested and refined through countless generations, but had never been applied to the unprecedented challenge of communicating with other humans who were simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. Yet somehow, despite the enormous potential for misunderstanding and conflict, despite the linguistic barriers and cultural differences that separated them, despite the competition for resources that must have been an ever-present reality in landscapes where survival margins were always narrow, these first encounters led not to immediate warfare, but to something more complex and ultimately more significant, a gradual process of mutual recognition, cautious cooperation, and cultural exchange that would profoundly influence the development of both species. Archaeological evidence suggests that the initial contact zones were regions of remarkable cultural innovation, places where tool-making traditions that had remained stable for tens of thousands of years suddenly began to show rapid changes and improvements, where new techniques appeared that combined elements from both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens traditions, where the rate of technological development accelerated dramatically as ideas and innovations flowed back and forth between communities that were learning to see each other not as threats to be eliminated, but as sources of valuable knowledge and potential allies in the endless struggle for survival. Communication would have been a challenge requiring enormous patience and creativity. Two species that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution, each with their own vocal capabilities and linguistic traditions, each carrying concepts and categories of thought that might have no direct equivalent in the other's mental framework, yet somehow they found ways to share information about hunting techniques, tool-making methods, the locations of resources, the behavior of animals, the patterns of weather and seasonal change that were crucial for survival in environments where a single mistake could mean death for entire communities. The evidence suggests that these interactions went far beyond mere practical cooperation to encompass forms of cultural exchange that indicate a deep mutual recognition of shared humanity. Neanderthal communities began incorporating elements of Homo sapiens artistic traditions, creating more complex ornamental objects and experimenting with new forms of symbolic expression, while Homo sapiens populations adopted Neanderthal tool-making techniques that were better adapted to European conditions and learned from their cousins' more sophisticated understanding of how to survive in cold climates. Perhaps most remarkably, genetic evidence indicates that these encounters led to interbreeding between the two species, creating hybrid populations that carried genetic material from both lineages and represented something entirely new in human evolution, communities that were neither purely Neanderthal nor purely Homo sapiens but something unprecedented, something that combined the accumulated wisdom and adaptation of both species into new forms of human consciousness and capability that were uniquely suited to the challenges and opportunities of their time and place. The children of these mixed unions would have grown up truly bicultural, learning hunting techniques and tool-making traditions from both lineages, speaking languages that incorporated elements from both parent communities, carrying in their minds and bodies the accumulated evolutionary wisdom of hundreds of thousands of years of parallel human development. They represented something that had never existed before in the history of life on Earth, conscious beings who embodied the synthesis of two different evolutionary experiments in intelligence and adaptability. But integration was not uniform or universal. Archaeological evidence suggests that while some regions saw extensive cooperation and interbreeding, others experienced more competitive relationships, with different human populations occupying the same territories at different times, alternately advancing and retreating as climate change and population pressures shifted the balance of advantage back and forth between different survival strategies and cultural adaptations. The encounter was not a single event, but an ongoing process that played out over thousands of years and thousands of individual meetings, each one unique, each one contributing to the gradual transformation of both species as they learned from each other, competed with each other, and ultimately began to merge into the complex hybrid populations that would carry forward the best adaptations from both lineages, while developing new capabilities that neither parent species had possessed alone. In valleys across Europe and the Middle East, around fires that burned with wood gathered by 4 different hands, under stars that looked down on conversations conducted in languages that borrowed words and concepts from 2 different traditions of human consciousness, the future of our species was being determined through countless small acts of cooperation, competition, understanding, and misunderstanding that would ultimately reshape the entire trajectory of human development on Earth, creating legacies that persist in our genes, our cultures, and our continuing capacity for both conflict and cooperation when we encounter others who are like us but not quite like us, familiar but not quite familiar, human but not quite human in ways that we recognize and understand. As the great ice sheets advanced and retreated across northern Europe with the slow persistence of geological time, both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations found themselves facing challenges that would test every innovation, every adaptation, every strategy for survival that hundreds of thousands of years of evolution had written into their genes and their cultures, challenges that required not just individual resilience but unprecedented levels of cooperation, planning, and technological sophistication to extract life from landscapes that seemed designed to defeat any attempt at permanent human habitation. The Ice Age was not a single period of uniform cold but rather a complex cycle of glacial advances and retreats, each one lasting thousands of years, each one creating its own unique environmental conditions that demanded different survival strategies, different relationships with the natural world, different ways of organizing human communities to maximize the chances that knowledge and culture could be preserved and transmitted even through the darkest and coldest periods when survival itself seemed like an act of defiance against a universe determined to eliminate consciousness from the face of the Earth. Imagine the landscape of Europe 30,000 years ago, when the glaciers reached their maximum extent and ice sheets thousands of feet thick stretched from Scandinavia to the heart of what is now Germany, creating a periglacial environment where summer temperatures barely rose above freezing, and winter brought months of darkness and cold that could kill the unprepared within hours of exposure, where the wind carried the constant reminder that warmth and safety existed only in the small spheres of controlled environment that human intelligence and cooperation could create and maintain against the overwhelming hostility of the natural world. In this harsh environment, survival required mastery of technologies and techniques that represented some of the most sophisticated achievements of prehistoric human civilization. The construction of shelters using mammoth bones and carefully prepared hides that could provide protection from wind and cold while remaining portable enough to be moved when following migrating herds or when local resources became exhausted. The development of clothing systems that layered different materials to create effective insulation while allowing sufficient mobility for hunting and other essential activities. The creation of food preservation techniques that could store meat and other nutrients through months when fresh resources were simply unavailable. Both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations developed sophisticated strategies for hunting the megafauna that dominated the Ice Age landscape, creatures whose size and power required coordination, planning, and technological innovation on a scale that would not have been necessary in more temperate environments where smaller game and plant resources could provide adequate nutrition with less risk and less investment of time and energy. The woolly mammoth, standing 12 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing as much as 8 tons, represented both an enormous opportunity and an enormous challenge, enough meat to feed a large community for weeks or months if properly preserved, but also a dangerous adversary that could kill hunters who made mistakes in planning or execution. Archaeological evidence reveals that both species developed complex hunting strategies that involved careful observation of animal behavior, sophisticated understanding of herd dynamics and migration patterns, and coordination between multiple hunting parties that could position themselves to drive animals into natural traps or predetermined killing grounds where spears and other weapons could be used most effectively. These hunts required not just physical courage but extraordinary planning abilities, the capacity to envision future scenarios and coordinate the actions of dozens of individuals across extended periods of time to achieve outcomes that were never guaranteed and always carried the risk of injury or death for participants. The tools they created for these hunts represent some of the finest achievements of Stone Age technology, spear points crafted with such precision that modern attempts to replicate them often fail to match their effectiveness, compound tools that combined multiple materials and required sophisticated understanding of the physical properties of stone, bone, wood, and sinew, hafting techniques that could create secure connections between different components while allowing for easy repair and replacement when tools were damaged in use. But survival in the Ice Age required more than just successful hunting. It demanded comprehensive mastery of the entire ecosystem, detailed knowledge of which plants could provide nutrition during the brief summer growing seasons, understanding of how to locate and exploit resources that were available year-round, techniques for predicting weather patterns and seasonal changes that could mean the difference between finding shelter in time and being caught in deadly storms without adequate protection from wind and cold, blowing snow that could disorient even experienced travelers and lead them away from safety into landscapes where rescue was impossible. Fire became even more crucial during the Ice Age, not just as a source of warmth and protection, but as the technological foundation that made possible all other survival strategies: cooking that could extract maximum nutrition from available food resources, tool making that required controlled heat to work stone and bone and other materials, the processing of hides and plant materials that were essential for clothing and shelter, and perhaps most importantly, the creation of social spaces where communities could gather during the long months of winter darkness to share knowledge, tell stories, maintain the cultural traditions that gave meaning and purpose to existence, even under the most challenging circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age populations developed sophisticated social structures that maximized the chances of survival through cooperation and resource sharing, with different individuals specializing in different aspects of the survival challenge, some focusing on hunting and tool making, others on gathering and food processing, still others on child rearing and the transmission of cultural knowledge, creating communities where the loss of any individual represented not just personal tragedy, but potentially catastrophic loss of irreplaceable expertise and understanding. The evidence also suggests that both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations maintained contact networks that extended across hundreds of miles, allowing different communities to share information about resource availability, weather patterns, animal movements, and technological innovations, creating support systems that could provide assistance during local crises and ensure that knowledge developed in one region could benefit human populations across vast geographic areas. These networks required sophisticated communication systems, shared languages, or at least shared symbolic conventions that could convey complex information across cultural and linguistic barriers. During this period of intense environmental pressure, the interaction between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations intensified, with archaeological sites showing evidence of rapid technological development and cultural exchange that suggests both species were learning from each other, adapting successful innovations, and developing new approaches that combine the best elements of both traditions. The challenge of Ice Age survival was apparently too great for any single human lineage to face alone. Success required the accumulated wisdom and innovation of all available human intelligence working together against the common enemy of extinction. Yet even as cooperation increased, competition for resources also intensified as the habitable zones of Europe contracted under the pressure of advancing ice, forcing human populations into smaller and smaller areas where every valley, every cave, every reliable source of water or wood or stone became precious beyond measure and worth defending against any potential threat. The same environmental pressures that encouraged cooperation also created conditions where conflict was sometimes inevitable, where different human communities found themselves competing directly for resources that were essential for survival but insufficient to support all the populations that needed them. The Ice Age represented perhaps the greatest test that human consciousness had faced since its emergence on the African savannas millions of years earlier. A test that required not just individual intelligence and adaptability, but unprecedented levels of cooperation, technological innovation, and cultural sophistication to maintain human populations in environments that seemed designed to eliminate any possibility of conscious life, environments where survival itself became an assertion of human will against a universe that appeared fundamentally hostile to the continuation of intelligence, culture, and the endless human quest to understand our place in the vast sweep of cosmic evolution. In the quiet spaces between competition and cooperation, in the tentative moments when suspicion gave way to curiosity and fear transformed into wonder, something unprecedented in the history of consciousness began to unfold as Neanderthal and Homo sapiens communities discovered that their differences were not barriers to be overcome but complementary strengths that could be shared, combined, and transformed into new capabilities that neither species could have developed alone, creating the first true cultural renaissance in human history as two different experiments in intelligence learned to see through each other's eyes and imagine possibilities that had never existed before in the long evolution of mind on Earth. Archaeological evidence reveals that the contact zones between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations became centers of remarkable innovation, places where tool-making traditions that had remained stable for tens of thousands of years suddenly began to show rapid development and improvement, where new techniques appeared that were clearly influenced by exchange of knowledge between different human communities, where the rate of cultural change accelerated dramatically as ideas flowed back and forth between groups that were learning to see each other not as competitors for limited resources, but as sources of valuable wisdom and potential partners in the endless challenge of extracting survival and meaning from an often hostile natural world. The Neanderthals brought to this exchange their sophisticated understanding of European environments, their mastery of cold-weather survival techniques, their precision stoneworking traditions that could create tools of remarkable effectiveness and durability, and perhaps most valuable of all, their deep knowledge of animal behavior and hunting strategies that had been tested and refined through hundreds of thousands of years of successful adaptation to the challenging conditions of Ice Age Europe, knowledge that represented an irreplaceable repository of practical wisdom about how to live sustainably in landscapes that could kill the unprepared within days or hours. Homo sapiens contributed their own unique innovations, more sophisticated projectile technologies that allowed hunting at greater distances with increased safety and effectiveness, more complex social organization strategies that could coordinate the activities of larger groups across extended periods of time, and perhaps most significantly, more advanced symbolic and artistic traditions that opened up new possibilities for storing and transmitting cultural information across generations, creating forms of external memory that could preserve knowledge even when individual experts were lost to accident, disease, or the countless other hazards that made survival always uncertain and always precious. The exchange was not simply a matter of one group adopting techniques developed by the other, but rather a complex process of cultural synthesis that created innovations that were genuinely new, combinations of elements from both traditions that produced capabilities that surpassed what either species had achieved independently. Neanderthal precision in stoneworking combined with Homo sapiens innovations in hafting and projectile design to create composite tools of unprecedented sophistication and effectiveness. Neanderthal knowledge of European plant and animal resources combined with Homo sapiens' mobility and networking abilities to create expanded trade systems that could move valuable materials and information across distances that neither group had previously been able to span. Perhaps most remarkably, the evidence suggests that this cultural exchange was accompanied by genuine mutual respect and recognition of shared humanity, with both groups adopting elements of each other's artistic and symbolic traditions, creating ornamental objects that combine design motifs from both cultures, and developing shared conventions for marking territory, indicating resource ownership, and communicating complex information about environmental conditions, resource availability, and potential dangers that could affect the survival of all human communities in the region regardless of their specific lineage or cultural background. Archaeological sites from this period show unprecedented levels of technological sophistication, tools that required multiple stages of preparation and manufacturing, involving different materials that had to be obtained from distant sources and processed using techniques that required specialized knowledge and considerable skill to execute successfully. The creation of these complex tools required not just individual expertise but coordinated effort from multiple specialists, suggesting forms of social organization that were more sophisticated than anything seen in earlier human populations and that may have developed specifically to take advantage of the opportunities created by contact and cooperation between different human lineages. The evidence also suggests that artistic and symbolic traditions underwent rapid development during this period, with both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations creating more complex ornamental objects, experimenting with new forms of symbolic expression, and developing shared aesthetic conventions that allowed different communities to recognize and appreciate each other's artistic achievements even across significant cultural and linguistic barriers. Cave paintings from this period show influences from both traditions combining Neanderthal precision and attention to anatomical detail with Homo sapiens' innovation in symbolic representation and narrative composition. Music and other forms of artistic expression may have played particularly important roles in facilitating communication and cultural exchange between different human populations, providing universal languages that could convey emotional and aesthetic information even when practical communication was limited by linguistic differences. Bone flutes and other musical instruments from this period show design influences from both traditions, suggesting that music served as a bridge between different human communities and helped create shared cultural experiences that transcended the boundaries between different lineages and different ways of organizing human society. The exchange was not limited to material culture, but extended to social and spiritual traditions as well, with evidence suggesting that both groups influenced each other's burial practices, ritual behaviors, and spiritual beliefs. Neanderthal sites from this period show increased use of symbolic objects in burial contexts, while Homo sapiens sites show adoption of Neanderthal techniques for preparing and positioning bodies in ways that suggest growing appreciation for the spiritual traditions that both species had developed to cope with the mystery of death and the challenge of maintaining community solidarity in the face of individual mortality. Perhaps most significantly, genetic evidence indicates that the cultural exchange was accompanied by biological exchange as well, with interbreeding between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations, creating hybrid communities that represented something entirely new in human evolution. Groups that combined the genetic heritage of both lineages and were therefore uniquely adapted to take advantage of cultural innovations from both traditions while developing their own distinctive approaches to the challenges of survival and social organization. The children of mixed unions grew up truly bicultural, learning hunting techniques from both parent lineages, speaking languages that incorporated elements from both traditions, and developing worldviews that synthesized different approaches to understanding the natural world and humanity's place within it. These hybrid populations may have been particularly innovative and adaptable, combining the best genetic and cultural adaptations from both parent species while being less constrained by traditional approaches that had worked well in the past, but might not be optimal for changing environmental conditions or new challenges that required unprecedented solutions. The period of intense cultural exchange created a flowering of human achievement that represented the first true renaissance in the history of consciousness, a time when the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of thousands of years of parallel human development suddenly became available to single communities that could combine innovations and insights from multiple lineages to create new forms of technology, art, social organization, and spiritual understanding that were more sophisticated and more effective than anything that had existed previously in human history. Yet even as cooperation and exchange reached unprecedented levels, the same environmental and population pressures that had encouraged contact between different human groups were also creating conditions that would ultimately test whether the new hybrid communities and enhanced cultural traditions would be sufficient to ensure the survival of all human lineages, or whether the resources and territories of Ice Age Europe were simply insufficient to support multiple forms of human consciousness, setting the stage for competition and conflict that would determine which approaches to being human would survive into the future and which would be lost forever to the endless cycle of evolutionary change and environmental challenge. In caves whose walls still bear the traces of humanity's first attempts to capture the essence of existence itself, in the flickering light of fires that burned 40,000 years ago, something extraordinary began to emerge from the meeting of Neanderthal precision and Homo sapiens imagination, the birth of symbolic thought as we know it today, the moment when human consciousness transcended the immediate necessities of survival to grapple with abstract concepts, eternal questions, and the mysterious relationship between mind and reality that would ultimately give rise to everything from religious belief to scientific inquiry, from artistic expression to philosophical understanding, transforming scattered bands of intelligent hunters into the creators of culture, meaning, and purpose in a universe that had known only matter and energy and the blind processes of physical law. Archaeological evidence suggests that the contact between different human lineages catalyzed an explosion of symbolic activity that was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication, as if the meeting of different forms of consciousness had created new possibilities for understanding and expressing the inner life of the mind, new ways of representing not just the external world of animals and landscapes and practical concerns, but the internal world of dreams, hopes, fears, and the growing awareness that human consciousness itself was something unique and precious and worthy of celebration and preservation through forms of expression that could survive the death of individual minds and carry meaning forward through generations. The cave paintings of this period represent perhaps the most dramatic evidence of this cognitive revolution, images created with such skill and artistic sensitivity that they still have the power to move viewers 40,000 years after they were painted, capturing not just the external appearance of animals, but something deeper, something that speaks to the essential spirit of life itself, the mysterious vitality that animates matter and transforms it into beings capable of thought, feeling, and the endless quest to understand their place in the vast sweep of cosmic evolution from the first moments after the Big Bang to the emergence of consciousness and beyond. These early artists worked by firelight in the deepest recesses of caves, often in chambers that required difficult and dangerous journeys to reach, suggesting that the creation of art was not merely decorative or entertainment but something sacred, something that required separation from the ordinary world of daily survival to achieve the focused concentration necessary to translate inner vision into external reality, to capture on stone walls the images that lived in memory and imagination and transform them into permanent records that could be shared with others and preserved for future generations. The techniques they developed were remarkably sophisticated, using the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects, mixing pigments from different minerals to achieve subtle variations in color and shading, employing perspective and movement in ways that demonstrate deep understanding of visual perception and artistic composition. These were not crude attempts at representation but skilled works of art that required planning, preparation, technical expertise, and aesthetic vision of the highest order, created by individuals who had developed their abilities through years of practice and study under the guidance of master artists who had preserved and transmitted the accumulated knowledge of their craft across generations. But the symbolic revolution extended far beyond cave painting to encompass every aspect of human culture, the creation of increasingly sophisticated ornamental objects that served no practical survival function but expressed individual and community identity, status, spiritual beliefs, and aesthetic preferences, the development of more complex burial practices that suggest evolving concepts of personal identity, afterlife, and the relationship between individual consciousness and the larger community of the living and the dead, the emergence of what appears to be ritualized behavior that created shared meaning and emotional connection between individuals who might otherwise have been separated by practical concerns and competitive pressures. Musical instruments from this period show remarkable innovation and sophistication, with bone flutes capable of producing complex melodies and rhythmic patterns that could coordinate group activities, facilitate communication across distances, and create shared aesthetic experiences that transcended the boundaries between different communities and different ways of organizing human society. Music may have been particularly important in facilitating contact between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations, providing a universal language that could convey emotional and spiritual information even when practical communication was limited by linguistic differences and cultural barriers. The evidence suggests that both lineages contributed to this symbolic revolution, with Neanderthals bringing their precision and attention to detail, their sophisticated understanding of materials and techniques, and their deep connection to the European landscape, while Homo sapiens contributed their innovations in abstract representation, narrative composition, and perhaps most importantly, their ability to envision and create complex symbolic systems that could encode multiple layers of meaning in single images or objects, creating forms of external memory that could preserve and transmit cultural information with unprecedented efficiency and reliability. The hybrid populations that resulted from interbreeding between the two species may have been particularly important in driving this cultural revolution, combining genetic and cultural heritage from both lineages to create individuals who were uniquely capable of synthesizing different approaches to symbolic expression and developing new forms of artistic and spiritual understanding that were more sophisticated than anything either parent species had achieved independently. These bicultural individuals may have served as bridges between different communities, translating concepts and techniques from one tradition to another and facilitating the rapid spread of innovations across vast geographic areas. The emergence of symbolic thought had profound implications for human social organization, creating new possibilities for coordination and cooperation that went far beyond immediate kinship ties or practical alliances based on resource sharing and mutual defense. Shared symbols could create bonds of identity and loyalty between individuals who had never met, allowing human communities to expand beyond the size limitations imposed by direct personal relationships and creating the foundation for more complex forms of social organization that could coordinate the activities of hundreds or thousands of individuals across extended periods of time and vast geographic distances. Religious and spiritual beliefs may have emerged during this period as human consciousness grappled with fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of death, the relationship between mind and matter, and humanity's place in a universe that seemed vast beyond comprehension, yet intimate enough to respond to human hopes, fears, and attempts to find purpose and meaning in the face of uncertainty, mortality, and the endless challenge of survival in a world that offered no guarantees except change itself and the constant need to adapt to new conditions and new challenges. The development of symbolic thought also created new possibilities for preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations, allowing human communities to accumulate cultural information at unprecedented rates and develop increasingly sophisticated understanding of their environment, their technology, and their own nature as conscious beings capable of reflection, planning, and deliberate attempts to shape their own destiny rather than simply responding to immediate circumstances and environmental pressures. Perhaps most remarkably, the symbolic revolution seems to have been accompanied by growing awareness of human consciousness itself as something unique and precious, something worth celebrating and preserving and exploring through forms of expression that had never existed before in the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth. The cave paintings, musical instruments, ornamental objects, and ritual behaviors of this period all point toward a growing understanding that human beings were not simply another species of animal struggling for survival, but something unprecedented, creatures capable of creating meaning, beauty, and purpose in a universe that had previously known only the blind processes of physical law and biological evolution. This birth of symbolic consciousness represented perhaps the most significant transformation in human development since the original emergence of intelligence itself, creating the foundation for everything that would follow in human cultural evolution: language, art, science, religion, philosophy, and all the other achievements that distinguish human civilization from every other form of life that has ever existed on this planet. Achievements that continue to evolve and develop today as we grapple with the same fundamental questions about consciousness, meaning, and purpose that first emerged in those firelit caves where our ancestors began the long journey toward understanding what it means to be human in a cosmos that still holds more mysteries than answers, more wonder than certainty, more possibilities than we can imagine or explore in any single lifetime, but that continues to call us toward greater understanding, greater creativity, and greater appreciation for the extraordinary gift of consciousness itself. In the most intimate chambers of the cell, in the spiraling architecture of DNA that carries the accumulated memory of 4 billion years of evolution, the story of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens interaction was being written in a language older than words, more permanent than stone tools, more revealing than any archaeological artifact, the language of genetics itself, which would preserve across tens of thousands of years the record of encounters between different forms of human consciousness, encounters that transcended the boundaries between species to create something entirely new in the history of life on Earth. Hybrid populations that carried within their very chromosomes the biological proof that love, curiosity, and the fundamental recognition of shared humanity could overcome even the vast gulf of evolutionary separation that had divided our lineages for hundreds of thousands of years. The genetic evidence reveals that interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not a rare accident but a recurring pattern that played out across thousands of years and thousands of individual relationships, suggesting that despite their physical differences and cultural variations, despite the competition for resources and territory that must have created tension and conflict between different human populations, there was something deeper that drew these two forms of consciousness together, perhaps the recognition that they were both participants in the same grand experiment of intelligence emerging from matter, both carriers of the same essential spark that distinguishes conscious beings from the rest of the natural world. Imagine the complexity of those first relationships between individuals who were simultaneously familiar and foreign, human and yet not quite human in ways that must have been both fascinating and unsettling to minds that had never encountered beings so similar to themselves, yet so distinctively different in appearance, behavior, and cultural tradition. The physical differences would have been immediately apparent, the robust build and heavy features of Neanderthals contrasting with the more gracile anatomy of Homo sapiens, differences in vocal apparatus that might have made communication challenging even when both groups were attempting to establish peaceful contact and mutual understanding. Yet somehow, across these barriers of anatomy and culture and language, relationships formed that were intimate enough to produce offspring, suggesting levels of communication, cooperation, and mutual acceptance that went far beyond mere practical alliances based on shared survival needs or temporary resource-sharing agreements. These relationships represented something unprecedented in human evolution, conscious choices to bridge the gap between different forms of humanity, to create bonds that transcended the boundaries of species and lineage and cultural tradition to establish new forms of family and community that had never existed before in the long history of consciousness on Earth. The children of these mixed unions faced unique challenges and unique opportunities, growing up in communities that might include parents, relatives, and neighbors from two different human lineages. learning to navigate between different cultural traditions and different approaches to everything from tool-making to spiritual belief, developing identities that incorporated elements from both parent species while creating something genuinely new and unprecedented in human experience. These hybrid individuals were living bridges between different forms of human consciousness, carrying in their minds and bodies the accumulated evolutionary wisdom of both lineages while developing their own distinctive approaches to the challenges of survival, social organization, and cultural development. Genetic analysis reveals that the Neanderthal contribution to modern human DNA varies significantly across different populations, with some groups carrying substantial Neanderthal heritage, while others show little or no evidence of interbreeding, suggesting that the hybrid populations were not uniformly distributed, but concentrated in specific regions and among specific communities that had particular opportunities or motivations for contact between different human lineages. These patterns of genetic inheritance tell stories of migration, population expansion, cultural exchange, and the complex dynamics of human interaction during one of the most significant periods in our species' development. The Neanderthal genes that survived in modern human populations were not randomly preserved, but were apparently selected for specific advantages they provided in particular environments or circumstances. Genes related to immune system function that may have provided resistance to diseases. Encountered as human populations expanded into new territories, genes affecting metabolism and cold adaptation that proved valuable as populations spread into northern climates. Genes influencing brain development and neural function that may have contributed to cognitive abilities and behavioral traits that enhance survival and reproductive success in specific contexts. But the genetic legacy goes beyond simple biological advantages to encompass more subtle influences on human psychology, behavior, and even personality traits that can be traced back to our Neanderthal heritage, suggesting that the impact of these ancient relationships continues to influence human consciousness and culture in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Some researchers have suggested that Neanderthal genes may contribute to variations in pain sensitivity, sleep patterns, mood regulation, and even artistic and creative abilities, indicating that our hybrid nature may be reflected not just in our physical characteristics, but in the fundamental ways we experience and interact with the world around us. The evidence also suggests that the genetic exchange was not unidirectional but involved gene flow in both directions, with Homo sapiens DNA appearing in Neanderthal populations as well, indicating that the hybrid communities were not simply Neanderthals who had acquired some Homo sapiens characteristics or vice versa, but genuinely new forms of human community that combined elements from both lineages in ways that created unprecedented possibilities for cultural and biological development. These bidirectional gene flows created complex patterns of ancestry and relationship that connected human populations across vast geographic areas and created the foundation for the genetic diversity that characterizes our species today. Archaeological evidence suggests that the periods of most intensive genetic exchange coincided with periods of rapid cultural innovation and technological development, indicating that the biological mixing was accompanied by intellectual and cultural synthesis that enhanced the adaptive capabilities of both lineages and created new possibilities for survival and development in challenging environments. The hybrid populations may have been particularly innovative and adaptable, combining genetic advantages from both parent species with cultural knowledge and traditions that drew from multiple sources and could be applied flexibly to new challenges and opportunities. The interbreeding also had profound implications for human social organization and cultural development, creating communities where identity and kinship relationships were more complex than anything that had existed in purely single lineage populations, where children might have grandparents from different species, and where cultural transmission had to accommodate multiple traditions and different approaches to everything from child-rearing to spiritual belief. These hybrid communities may have been among the first truly multicultural human societies, developing social structures and cultural practices that could integrate diverse perspectives and different forms of knowledge into coherent worldviews and effective survival strategies. The genetic evidence reveals that this period of hybridization was relatively brief in evolutionary terms, lasting perhaps only a few thousand years before the Neanderthal populations began to decline and eventually disappeared as distinct communities. But the impact of those few millennia of genetic and cultural exchange would reverberate through human development for tens of thousands of years to come, influencing everything from our physical appearance to our cognitive abilities to our capacity for cultural innovation and adaptation. Today, billions of humans carry Neanderthal DNA in their cells, making each of us a living testament to those ancient relationships that bridged the gap between different forms of human consciousness and created the hybrid heritage that defines our species today. Every time we breathe, every time our hearts beat, every time we think or dream or create something new, we are expressing not just our Homo sapiens inheritance, but also the genetic legacy of our Neanderthal cousins, whose contributions to human development were preserved not in monuments or written records but in the most intimate and permanent form possible, the DNA that carries forward the accumulated wisdom of evolution itself, and connects us directly to those ancient moments when two different experiments in consciousness recognized each other as kindred and chose to create something new together in the endless adventure of mind emerging from matter and reaching toward understanding, meaning, and purpose in a universe that continues to unfold in ways that neither lineage could have imagined alone. As the climate shifted, and the great ice sheets began their slow retreat toward the poles, the abundance that had sustained both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens populations through the peak of the Ice Age gradually gave way to scarcity, competition, and the harsh arithmetic of survival that would test every innovation, every alliance, every strategy for existence that hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution had developed, creating conditions where cooperation and conflict existed in constant tension, where today's ally might become tomorrow's competitor, for resources that were essential for survival, but insufficient to support all the human communities that needed them to maintain their populations, their cultures, and their hard-won mastery of landscapes that were themselves changing faster than adaptation could follow. The end of the Ice Age brought environmental changes that were both blessing and curse for human populations across Europe and Asia. The retreat of glaciers opened new territories for exploration and settlement, but it also disrupted the established patterns of animal migration, seasonal resource availability, and territorial boundaries that had provided the foundation for successful human adaptation during the preceding millennia, forcing communities that had developed sophisticated strategies for Ice Age survival to rapidly innovate new approaches for environments that were becoming warmer, more forested, and less predictable in their patterns of resource distribution and animal behavior. The great herds of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and other megafauna that had provided the protein foundation for large human communities began to decline and fragment as their preferred grassland habitats were replaced by expanding forests, forcing human populations to adapt to hunting smaller, more dispersed prey that required different techniques, different tools, different forms of social organization, and different relationships with the landscape itself. Communities that had specialized in mammoth hunting found themselves facing the extinction of their primary food source and the need to completely restructure their economic, social, and cultural systems around new forms of subsistence that were less predictable and less capable of supporting large, stable populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that this period of environmental transition was marked by increasing territorial competition between different human populations as the carrying capacity of the landscape declined and communities found themselves competing directly for access to the remaining patches of productive habitat. The last reliable water sources, the dwindling populations of large game animals that could still provide enough nutrition to support traditional lifestyles and social structures. What had once been a landscape large enough to accommodate multiple human lineages with minimal direct competition became a patchwork of contested territories where survival often depended on excluding others from access to essential resources. The competition was not simply between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens as distinct species, but between different communities within each lineage, different hybrid populations that combined genetic and cultural heritage from both parent species, and different adaptive strategies that emphasized various approaches to the challenge of extracting life from changing environments. Some communities focused on maintaining traditional hunting lifestyles by following the retreating megafauna toward northern refugia where Ice Age conditions persisted longer, while others innovated new subsistence strategies based on smaller game, intensive gathering, early forms of resource management, and perhaps even the beginnings of plant and animal domestication. The evidence suggests that Homo sapiens populations may have had certain advantages in this competition, particularly their greater mobility, more sophisticated projectile technologies, and more flexible social organization that could rapidly adapt to changing circumstances and exploit new opportunities as they emerged. Their long-distance communication networks allowed them to coordinate activities across larger geographic areas and respond more quickly to information about resource availability, environmental changes, and the movements of competing human populations, giving them strategic advantages in the complex game of territorial expansion and resource acquisition that determined survival during this critical period. Neanderthal populations, despite their sophisticated technology and deep knowledge of European environments, may have been disadvantaged by their smaller population sizes, more conservative cultural traditions, and greater specialization in hunting strategies that were perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions, but less effective in the rapidly changing post-glacial environment. Their robust physiology, which had been an advantage during the extreme cold of the Ice Age maximum, may have become a liability as climates warmed and the metabolic demands of maintaining large muscular bodies exceeded the nutritional resources available from smaller prey species and more dispersed food sources. The competition was not always direct or violent. Much of it may have played out through differential reproductive success as some communities thrived in the new environmental conditions, while others struggled with declining birth rates, increased infant mortality, and the gradual erosion of population numbers that made it difficult to maintain viable breeding populations and preserve essential cultural knowledge across generations. Communities that fell below critical threshold sizes found themselves caught in downward spirals where demographic decline made it increasingly difficult to defend territories, maintain technological traditions, and provide adequate care for children and elderly individuals who represented both the future and the accumulated wisdom of their cultures. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of increasing violence and conflict, with higher frequencies of trauma in skeletal remains, defensive site locations, and the appearance of weapons designed specifically for human combat rather than hunting, suggesting that peaceful coexistence between different human populations became increasingly difficult as resource competition intensified and territorial boundaries became more rigidly defined and defended. The hybrid communities that had flourished during periods of cooperation and cultural exchange found themselves forced to choose sides or forge new identities that could provide group solidarity and mutual defense in an increasingly competitive and dangerous world. Yet, even as competition intensified, the evidence also shows continued innovation and adaptation as human communities experimented with new technologies, new social organizations, and new relationships with their changing environment. Some populations developed more sophisticated hunting techniques that could effectively target smaller, more elusive prey species, while others invested in developing more intensive gathering strategies, early forms of food storage and processing, and perhaps even the beginnings of systematic environmental modification that would eventually lead to agriculture and permanent settlement. The period also saw continued cultural exchange and hybridization as different human populations came into contact through migration, territorial expansion, and the search for new resources and opportunities, creating new combinations of genetic heritage, technological tradition, and cultural knowledge that enhanced adaptive capabilities and created new possibilities for survival in challenging conditions. The most successful communities may have been those that could integrate innovations from multiple sources while maintaining sufficient internal cohesion to coordinate collective action and defend their territories and resources against competitors. Climate change continued to drive population movements and territorial reorganization as different regions experienced different patterns of environmental transformation. Some areas became more productive as temperatures warmed and growing seasons lengthened, while others became less hospitable as changing precipitation patterns altered water availability, vegetation communities shifted toward less useful species, or new diseases emerged that affected human populations, animal prey species, or useful plant resources. The evidence suggests that this period of intensifying competition and rapid environmental change was a crucial test of different approaches to human survival and cultural organization, with some strategies proving more resilient and adaptable than others. some populations thriving while others declined, and some cultural traditions being preserved and transmitted to future generations while others were lost forever to the relentless pressures of demographic competition and environmental transformation. The outcomes of this competition would determine not only which human lineages would survive into the future, but also which approaches to technology, social organization, and environmental relationship would provide the foundation for all subsequent human development. The struggle was not merely for physical survival, but for the preservation of consciousness itself, for the continuation of the accumulated wisdom, cultural traditions, artistic achievements, and spiritual understanding that different human communities had developed over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and cultural development, creating a situation where the loss of any population represented not just demographic decline but irreplaceable losses of human knowledge, creativity, and understanding that could never be recovered or reconstructed once the communities that created and maintained them had disappeared from the earth forever. In the deep, shadowed rock shelters of southern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, the last refuge, the very edge of the continent, the final chapters of the Neanderthal story were written, not in a sudden catastrophic erasure, but in a long, quiet, poignant deceleration toward extinction as a distinct lineage. This was not a quick conquest, nor was it a simple war of replacement. It was a gradual, millennia-long demographic and cultural fade, a slow dimming of the last fires as the descendants of the northern lords found themselves increasingly isolated, outcompeted, and eventually absorbed into the larger, more flexible and geographically extensive human diaspora emanating from the south and east. Picture those last Neanderthal communities, smaller than any their ancestors had known, huddled around precious, meticulously maintained hearths. Their movements are more constrained now, their knowledge of the immediate territory unparalleled, but the surrounding landscape is increasingly claimed by others, by the vigorous, rapidly expanding Homo sapiens groups, whose lighter toolkits, diverse diets, and larger social networks gave them a relentless edge in the competition for limited, fragmented resources. The difference was not in intelligence, nor necessarily in survival skill, but in the architecture of society and the velocity of innovation. The Neanderthals were slow to adopt the advanced projectile technologies and the elaborate symbolic systems of their new neighbors. Their culture was deep, stable, and profoundly conservative, a strength that had ensured their survival through countless Ice Age cycles, but now became a fatal inertia in a world demanding rapid, continuous adaptation. As Homo sapiens populations expanded, they created an ever-tightening net of competition, occupying the most productive shelters, utilizing the most efficient hunting methods for the new forested environment, and dominating the social and resource networks that were becoming critical for long-term survival. The genetic evidence tells the most intimate and heartbreaking part of this final story. As the Neanderthal population numbers dropped, the instances of interbreeding with Homo sapiens became proportionally more significant, acting as a final conduit of genetic material. The remaining Neanderthal genes did not simply disappear, they were diluted and absorbed, integrated into the vast and growing gene pool of the conquering species. The pure Neanderthal lineage ceased to exist, not primarily through violent annihilation, but through a kind of demographic flooding. The small pockets of deeply adapted Europeans were simply overwhelmed by the sheer migratory volume of the newcomers, their unique genetic signature gradually disappearing into the dominant waveform of the modern human species. Did they know, those last Neanderthals, that they were the final generation? Did the elders look at the children, their faces perhaps softened by a trace of Homo sapiens ancestry, their tools a mix of ancient tradition and new innovation, and sense the ending of their particular way of being human? The extinction was not the death of a single person, but the fading of a collective mind, the loss of a unique library of knowledge about the deep European past, a distinct form of consciousness that had successfully survived climatic extremes for nearly 500,000 years. Their mastery had reached its absolute end, leaving a silence in the caves that only the echoes of their passing could fill. Their passing leaves us with a profound philosophical echo. What is the true measure of survival? Is it the continuation of a pure lineage, or the successful transmission of essential genetic and cultural wisdom? In a strange, unexpected twist of deep time, the Neanderthals did not entirely perish. A small, essential piece of their mastery, their immune system adaptations, their cold weather metabolism, their ability to cope with high-altitude environments was preserved and passed down. They live on not as a separate species staring back at us from a distant valley, but as a subtle, essential silent partner within the very fabric of our own Homo sapiens being, a ghost in the machine of our own DNA. A testament to that brief, pivotal era when two different humanities shared the same landscape and chose in moments of love or necessity to become one. With the physical disappearance of the Neanderthals as a distinct population, the long, perilous journey of human evolution entered a new singular phase. The world belonged to a single surviving human lineage, the hybrid and highly adaptable Homo sapiens that had absorbed the genetic wisdom and much of the practical knowledge of their cousins. But the legacy of the encounter did not end with their physical absorption. It transformed, shifting from a biological reality into a profound unspoken cultural and psychological inheritance that continues to shape our understanding of ourselves, our relationship with difference, and the very concept of human identity. The encounter gave birth not only to our ancestors but to the first great human myth, the myth of the other. As the last distinct Neanderthal bands faded into the cultural memory of the expanding modern human communities, they left behind a deep, unsettling absence. We, the sole survivors, lost our mirror. For the first and last time in the history of Homo sapiens, there had been another kind of humanity, a creature so like us yet so definitively not us. Once the physical memory of their difference faded, what remained was a powerful, unconscious template for defining us against them. Could the very concept of human difference, the urge to categorize, separate, and fear those who look or behave in subtly different ways, find its deepest root in that initial, unsettling encounter with the Neanderthals? The struggle for survival was now over, but the philosophical struggle with our own singularity was just beginning. We became the lonely species, the only consciousness that walks the earth, left to project our deepest fears and insecurities onto the closest available substitute, other groups of Homo sapiens. The myth of the pure lineage, the idea of an unbroken, unmixed us, became a powerful and dangerous fiction, necessary for group cohesion, yet fundamentally contradicted by the very genes that flowed through the veins of every surviving community. From this pivotal time, the surviving human lineage experienced an unprecedented acceleration of cultural evolution, freed from the pressures of direct interspecies competition, and with a gene pool fortified by Neanderthal adaptations, Homo sapiens rapidly expanded their territories, refined their technologies, and deepened their symbolic lives. The birth of agriculture, the domestication of animals, the foundation of permanent settlements, and the eventual rise of cities and civilizations, all these events, which define the historical era, occurred within the single lineage world that remained after the Neanderthals' passing. It is a world where every single innovation, every philosophical leap, every piece of music, every work of art, and every scientific discovery flows from that one, hybrid evolutionary experiment. Today, as we analyze the Neanderthal genome, as we reconstruct their lives from fragments of stone and bone, we are not merely studying an extinct species, we are reclaiming a lost part of ourselves. We are confronting the truth of our hybrid past, acknowledging that the human story is one of complexity, exchange, and messy convergence, not of simple, linear purity. The quiet reflection that should end this long journey is the understanding that the Neanderthal legacy is the truth of our own interconnectedness, a reminder that our species, the sole heir to all of human possibility, is built upon the very differences and exchanges that history has often tried to forget. Look around you now, at the complexity of your own world, the differences between nations, cultures, and beliefs. Remember the first time two humanities met in the twilight of the Ice Age, and realize that every challenge we face today in bridging divides, in seeking understanding across difference, is merely the latest echo of that original encounter, a final test of the hybrid intelligence that survived where its cousin could not. We are the synthesis. We are the product of the merge. And in that very truth lies both the fragility of our memory and the immense untapped potential of our shared singular future. As the echoes of the deep past fade, and the screen of time shifts to the vast, uncertain future, remember that the journey never truly ends. If this quiet exploration of our ancient roots has stirred your curiosity, If the thought of those first fires and final meetings lingers with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for our next journey back into the depths of human history and the grand, unfolding tapestry of life on Earth.